You think the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death, but what if every coffin, every pyramid, every prayer, and every painted tomb wall was really part of one desperate attempt to stop life from disappearing? You think you know ancient Egypt the moment you see it. A pyramid burning under desert light, a painted coffin sealed in silence, a face wrapped for eternity, rows of amulets sleeping beside the dead, dark chambers crowded with gold, linen, ritual, and fear. A priest bends over a body that no longer breathes. A funeral procession moves across the sand as if the whole civilization has turned its eyes toward the grave. A modern visitor enters a museum and meets Egypt exactly where death survived best. In mummies, tomb walls, funerary texts, burial masks, and stone. And so the conclusion comes easily. This must have been a civilization obsessed with endings, a people who organized beauty around the corpse, a culture that stared so long at death it built mountains for the dead. But then the image begins to shift. The same pyramid changes when the light moves across it. The same tomb speaks differently when you ask a harder question. Was Egypt truly living for death? Or were the Egyptians doing something far more human and far more haunting? Were they trying, with every tool they had, to stop death from having the final word?
What do you think death meant to an Egyptian who refused to see it as disappearance? In the modern imagination, death is often a wall. In ancient Egypt, it was closer to a gate. Heavy, dangerous, sacred, but still a threshold. The dead were laid out not as waste, but as travelers being prepared. The body mattered because the person was not supposed to dissolve into nothing. The organs were protected, the flesh was preserved. The face was given back its identity through a mask. The name was cut into stone so memory could anchor existence. Texts were folded into tombs not to decorate the silence, but to guide someone through it. Food was stored, furniture was placed, servant figurines waited nearby. Lamps of belief were lit inside chambers of darkness. This was not an art of ending beautifully, it was an architecture of continuation. The Egyptian dead were not being admired as ruins, they were being equipped as survivors. In that world, to die was not simply to stop, it was to enter the most dangerous passage of all, where only the prepared could hope to remain fully themselves.
Why would a civilization believe so deeply in rebirth unless the land itself kept teaching that lesson? Look at the Nile before you look at the tomb. Look at the flood before you look at the coffin. Each year the river swelled, covered the fields, withdrew, and left behind black fertile soil where life seemed to rise from what looked like ruin. Seeds vanished into darkness, then returned as grain. The sun sank each evening and rose again as if swallowed only to be reborn. Brown floodwater erased boundaries and then gave the land back richer than before. A child growing up in Egypt did not learn renewal from abstract theology alone. He learned it from mud, from harvest, from dawn, from the patience of seasons. The Egyptians did not invent resurrection out of emptiness. They were surrounded by a world where death-like states kept yielding life. The green ribbon of the Nile cut through desert like a promise that endings could be temporary. So when they imagined the human being passing through death, they were not thinking against nature, they were thinking with it. In their eyes, darkness was terrifying, yes, but darkness was also where the next form of life often began.
What do you think the Egyptians truly feared? Death itself, or the possibility of being undone? This is where the story sharpens. The greatest horror was not always the last breath. It was decay. It was erasure. It was the name being cut away from stone. It was the face smashed from a statue. It was the body abandoned to heat, sand, insects, and time. It was the tomb left without offerings. It was memory snapping like a rope. The ideal of order, what we now call Mot, held the world upright. Against it stood chaos, dismemberment, namelessness, and the terrifying idea of no longer belonging anywhere in the cosmic pattern. So every funerary act became resistance. The embalmer was not merely preserving tissue, he was fighting disintegration. The carver who cut a name into a coffin was not decorating death, he was defending identity. The family placing offerings in the tomb was not indulging grief, they were refusing abandonment. A burial chamber became an eternal house because the worst fate was not to die once, but to be scattered, forgotten, and swallowed by disorder forever.
What would happen to a kingdom if its divine king died and did not continue to exist? In Egypt, the question was never merely personal. Pharaoh was not just a ruler with a crown. He was the living hinge between earth and the sacred order above it. If his death were mishandled, the danger was symbolic, political, cosmic. That is why the pyramid was never only a tomb. It was a machine of continuity, a technology of royal afterlife, a mountain of stone built so that power itself could survive the grave. Around it rose mortuary temples, priesthoods, offering systems, processions, storerooms, records, labor schedules, and all the administrative muscle needed to keep a dead king alive in ritual time. Men dragging blocks across the desert were not simply burying a body, they were stabilizing a worldview. Officials counting grain and rations were not feeding a construction site alone. They were preserving legitimacy beyond the king's heartbeat. The pyramid, seen this way, is not pure vanity. It is organized belief turned into architecture. It is the state insisting that royal death must never become royal disappearance. How much of your life would you spend preparing for a world you believed was still waiting for you after death? For the Egyptians, the answer could be far more than we are comfortable imagining. The wealthy commissioned coffins while still alive. They gathered oil jars, furniture, jewelry, food, linens, amulets, and figurines for the future version of themselves. Families with less means still tried to place what they could beside the dead. Bread, beer, simple goods, small provisions against cosmic poverty. Across the land, a funerary economy grew around this belief. Carpenters, potters, embalmers, painters, stonecutters, priests, transporters, ritual specialists, an entire chain of labor existed because continuation had material requirements. A tomb was not outside the economy, it was one of its engines. To prepare for death was to make purchases, secure services, store goods, and convert wealth into endurance. Rich and poor did not enter the afterlife equally, but both faced it with the same fundamental desire. Do not let me arrive there empty, unnamed, unguarded, and alone.
Why would people fill tomb walls with banquets, music, harvests, boats, gardens, birds, bread, laughter, and family if they hated earthly life? This is the most revealing clue of all. Egyptian tomb art is crowded not only with gods and rites, but with pleasures. Men cutting grain, women carrying flowers, musicians entertaining guests, boats gliding over water, marsh hunts bursting with movement, tables covered with food, servants at work, children near adults, livestock, fields, festivals, sunlight, abundance. The dead were surrounded by images of life, because what they wanted was not annihilation dressed in ritual. What they wanted was continuity rich enough to feel familiar. They did not preserve bodies because they loved corpses. They preserved bodies because they loved personhood. They did not stock tombs because they worshipped emptiness. They stocked tombs because they could not bear the thought that taste, smell, touch, kinship, dignity, labor, rest, and joy should simply vanish. The obsession with death, once you look closely, begins to look like a refusal to surrender the world they loved.
Why do modern people see so much death when they look at Egypt? Because death survived better than daily life. Museums teach us through what remained. Coffins remained, mummies remained, tomb paintings remained. Stone temples and desert burials endured, where ordinary mud brick houses collapsed, flooded, cracked, and dissolved back into the earth. The archaeological record is real, but it is not neutral. It is weighted toward what dryness protected and what elites built to last. That means the Egypt that first meets our eyes is the Egypt of the tomb. Yet inside those tombs lies a vast archive of life. Bread recipes, family structures, labor scenes, boat travel, farming rhythms, music, furniture, clothing, social hierarchy, and household hope. The tomb became the storehouse of life because the Egyptians tried to carry life across the boundary of death. So when the museum visitor thinks these people lived only for burial, the evidence itself quietly answers back, no, what you are seeing is life preserved in the language of death. So what were the ancient Egyptians really doing all along? They were not kneeling before death in admiration. They were negotiating with it. They were building defenses against oblivion. They were trying to keep the body from breaking, the name from fading, the memory from snapping, the king from vanishing, the family line from losing its place, the self from dissolving into chaos. The coffin was not just a box, it was a shelter for identity. The pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a fortress against erasure. The offering was not just a ritual gesture, it was a lifeline stretched between worlds. Again and again, Egyptian civilization returns to the same plea. Let life continue. Let form continue. Let recognition continue. Let order continue. The people who seem, from a distance, to have lived for death may have been doing the exact opposite. They loved continuity so deeply that they turned burial into a weapon against finality. And that is why ancient Egypt still unsettles us. It forces us to confront a possibility more emotional than exotic, that the most elaborate culture of death in the ancient world may really have been one of humanity's greatest declarations of love for life.
They did not build for death because they worshipped it. They built against death because they could not accept the disappearance of life.